Привіт! Це подкаст «Коли все має значення». І моє ім'я Наталка Гуменюк. І зі мною
Ангеліна Карякіна. Привіт! І у нас знову міжконтинентальне майже включення. Наталка сьогодні з Південно-Африканської Республіки з нами говорить, де вона перебуває на конференції і спілкується, насправді, можна сказати, вже з нашими друзями, хорошими колегами. Наталко, розкажи, будь ласка, нам про сьогоднішнього гостя. Хто він і який стосунок він має до України?
Наш сьогоднішній гість – це дуже впливовий редактор південно-африканської газети City Press Mondli Makhanya. Він є представником такого молодого останнього покоління борців з апартеїдом. Це коли вже Мандела був легендарним і все завершувалося, він був молодим журналістом, який ще належить до руху за подолання цього режиму, але по суті був таким важливим політичним, журналістським, медійним голосом усі ці останні 30 років, відколи впав режим апартеїду. По суті, це такий, спікер, який всіх знає, все розуміє, але, скажімо, в чомусь навіть там камертон якогось суспільного розуму і совісті в Південній Африці. А я додам, я тут на Міжнародному демократичному конгресі, куди там з усіх світів, країн з'їхалися там до 60 учасників борців за демократію. Це гарний привід тут показати наші фільми. Мондлі, до речі, модеруватиме дискусію з редакторами південно-африканськими, яких ми тут збираємо і показуємо нашу роботу. Але мені важливо було з ним говорити, тому що про Південну Африку, зазвичай ми знаємо Нельсона Манделу, якщо говорити так, про політично, там, і про те, що боролися з режимом апартеїду. І потім там в комісії пам'яті і все таке. Але є якась прогалина існує між тим, повалили режим, і що є зараз. І є дуже багато якихось упереджень, думок, що з одного боку Південна Африка – найбагатша країна Африки. Вона пишається тим, що вони демократична країна. З іншого боку, вона все одно залишається дуже-дуже нерівною, але ніби вона вважається прикладом, коли суспільство подолало расову сегрегацію, але з іншого боку воно залишається розділеним. І я просто кажу, що зазвичай про Південну Африку говорять про її минуле, але в цьому випадку йдеться про сучасність, і нам важливо розуміти, що це залишається дуже важлива країна для всього континенту. Взагалі для світу. Вона вважається там лідером в Африці. Окремо поговоримо про політичні складнощі.
Ти робиш такий вже вступ ближче до, напевно, теми вашої розмови. Ще дуже коротко, я тебе запитала, який стосунок він має до України, Мондлі, Він був у нас в гостях. Він учасник нашої програми «Поєднуючи континенти», який приїздив до України разом з іншими редакторами, редакторками, журналістами в Україну рік тому.
Дійсно, було дуже принципово запросити представника з Південної Африки до України. І коли ми робили проект «Поєднуючи континенти», Мондлі представляв Південну Африку. Тоді дуже гостро стояло питання продовольчої кризи, зернової угоди, про розрив якої ми дізналися, сидячи в Офісі президента. Він також був на Херсонщині, в Посад-Покровському, в Миколаєві, в порті Нібулона, але, окрім того, бачив в Бучі, в Києві, спілкувався там з військовими, з політиками, з потерпілими. Він не, скажімо так, вже дуже не чужа людина, але я ще додам, я познайомилася з ним раніше, коли я вперше потрапила до Африки. Після повномасштабного вторгнення мене запросили дуже коротко на захід у Кенії. І це був захід для африканських редакторів. І там була одна українка. Коли нас попросили виступити в великій медіагрупі перед кенійськими журналістами, дали слово Мондлі, тому що він легендарний. І, мені по 5 хвилин. Це було дуже важливо, що він почав свою розмову з того, що ми маємо думати про Україну на континенті. Можливо, багато в чому його роль і надихнула частково цей проект, який ми робили. Тому що було зрозуміло, що його кенійці чують. Якби просто встала я і почала щось говорити про Україну, кенійські журналісти б мене не почули. Але коли виходить важливий, впливовий журналіст Південної Африки, яка важлива для всього континенту, і починає з розмови, що ми маємо бути небайдужими до того, що відбувається в Україні, зрозуміло, що, власне, можливо, якраз і треба шукати таких адвокатів, тому що не завжди ми можемо сказати самі. Має бути хтось той, хто, як він тоді, зміг кенійцям згадати про апартеїд, а потім згадати про те, як дезінформацію використовували в їхній внутрішній боротьбі, в політичному насильстві, і як важливо не вірити російській дезінформації. Це була зустріч, здається, в грудні 22-го року, перша наша. І, в принципі, в мене не було питань, кого кликати. Приїхати до України, коли ми потім консультувалися, було зрозуміло, що це мав бути Мондлі.
Я просто пам'ятаю, як він уважно слухав те, що я встигла побачити на тих зустрічах, де я його бачила, як він конспектував все уважно. Складно було не помітити щирий інтерес людини, професійний і людський. Скажи, будь ласка, про що саме ви говорили? Що цікавого в цій розмові?
Мені було важливо пояснити завдяки Мондлі українцям сучасну Південну Африку, її політику по відношенню до України і Росії, і нашої війни. Але пояснити теж, чи вдалося південноафриканцям. От вони дуже пишаються тим, чого вони досягли. Але якось потім так сталося, що в них був дуже корумпований режим. Але тепер вже ні. І цей був корумпований режим президента Зуми, який намагався пропонувати навіть такий в чомусь чорний націоналізм. Країна, яка пишалася тим, чого вона добилася, як багато хто каже, дійшла до ручки, тому що стала корумпованою, партія героїв перетворилася на партію корупціонерів. Південна Африка це подолала. Але ця партія залишається домінуючою, вона визначає. Ми говорили про спадок і оцю ностальгію за Радянським Союзом, яка визначає багато в чому симпатію, певну, до Росії, тому що Росія за 30 років змогла переконати, що от все, що робилося в Радянському Союзі, власне, робилося винятково Росією. Я просила також пояснити міжнародну розстановку сил під час апартеїду. Дійсно тоді і режим Тетчер, і режим Рейгана, і Ізраїль, вони підтримували режим апартеїду. А Радянський Союз був одним з тих, хто допомагав. І представники Африканського національного конгресу мали навіть тренування в Одесі, в Сімферополі. Для них це залишається країна, яка їх підтримувала. І так жорстко такі речі, які робили особливо наприкінці 80-х, на початку 90-х, конкретно Сполучені Штати, Британія і Ізраїль, це доволі нещодавно, тому треба зрозуміти цю частину. Я хотіла просити пояснити, скільки в таких закликах пар сьогодні помирити Україну між і Росію, скільки в цьому є просто симпатії до Радянського Союзу, скільки цієї традиції, ось ми країна, яка подолала, країна, де люди помирилися, що в цьому щирого чи ні. А тут є великі розмови про вплив також російської пропаганди, тому ми говорили про роль Russia Today, яка, скажімо, перебазувалася і відкрила величезне бюро в Південній Африці.
Вони зараз, працює, активно працює зараз?
Ні, там все дуже цікаво. Їх вирубили з телевізійного ефіру дуже різко, але вони пішли в онлайн, вони створили африканське бюро. Тобто все насправді доволі цікаво і складно. Але є ще одна людина, з чого ми почали, це Ілон Маск, який є південноафриканцем. Дуже багато людей, які зараз є оцих лібертаріанців в Силіконовій долині, які підтримали Трампа, вони є з Південної Африки. І тут цікаво, чи принесли в Америку оцей досвід перед Маском. Додам, що ми не говорили про жахи апартеїду, але те, що я побачила за кілька днів, будучи в багатьох музеях, спілкуючись з багатьма, ти розумієш, що такого системного, довгого режиму, який так принижував гідність людей, який так знущався над темношкірим населенням, годі уявити. Але Маск застав цей період, він був молодою людиною, в нього складні стосунки з Південною Африкою, колись ним пишалися, але він не любить цю країну. Тут є дуже багато дискусій про його батька, тому що з одного боку його батько зараз, як дуже багато білих південноафриканців, вони всі якось типу, ми до апартеїду не маємо стосунку, але він був представником іншої ліберальної партії, не тої партії, яка керувала країною, але білої партії всередині тоді ще влади, дуже багато там питань, а взагалі по поглядах Маск то хто. Про Ілона Маска всі зараз говорять, є причини. І, звісно, на батьківщині він з Преторії. Тому я скористалася можливістю трошки розказати, принаймні, про ставлення до нього, про сам режим колись апартеїду, про те, як боролися, як мирилися. Я думаю, про це треба робити окремий подкаст з людьми, з яким цим процесом займалися. В нас тут таких знайомих вже тепер багато. Але цей епізод, власне, більше пояснює і сучасну політику, і до чого дійшла пар, що це за країна, чому вона дуже важлива, але чому вона така, яка вона є.
Ну що ж, дуже цікаво. Слухаємо розмову Наталки з Мондлі Махання, головним редактором газети City Press, відомим впливовим південноафриканським редактором, журналістом. Поїхали.
Mondli, thank you so much for having me here in Johannesburg. I'm really glad to see you in person. And there are a number of things I want to talk. It's really about South Africa, your experience, Ukraine, Russia, like geopolitics, and your trip to Ukraine a year ago. But I really, because I'm just coming from the US elections, and we're having this guy named Elon Musk, who happened to be from almost here. Pretoria is nearby. You just explain what this person is and how he is seen in South Africa. Yes, he moved to the US when he was 16, and he pretends not to be South African, but he is.
As you say, Elon Musk is a South African, he grew up here, and he left. Oh, okay, fine, he was still young, but he was a young adult when he left. But, the attitude of South Africans towards Elon Musk used to be widely respected. People were proud of him. This is one of our own. He is making waves in the world. At that time, he was one of the world's richest people. Now he is the world's richest person. And South Africans took pride in the fact that we made him. But as time progressed, South Africans began to realize that this man wants nothing to do with you. He wants nothing to do with this country. He is not proud of the country that he comes from. He wants to create the biggest distance between himself and his country. Then South Africans began to resent him. And that resentment increased a lot when the story started to spread about how his former school was celebrating its centenary. They got in touch with his team because they wanted him to come and be the guest speaker. They wanted him to inspire the other boys to become him, that you too can become a big person in the world. But Elon Musk first ignored their requests, and then eventually, once he was irritated, he then decided that he wrote them a check, a substantial check, and sent it to them. And he told them never to get in touch with him again. And so this is a story kind of like it went around. Once South Africans heard this story, they began to take a very different attitude towards him, because what sort of person does that? And it was not about the school. It was about the country, but it was also about he speaks about being bullied at the school. So he has bad memories of the school. But it happens everywhere. Every school has that. There are school bullies. And it was not about you in particular. Kind of like kids are sometimes horrible to each other. So to be still carrying those scars to this day is very odd.
But when you say that he's not kind of proud of South Africa, what can you really say the background he brought from here to the US? Let's say like that. South Africa has a complex history of apartheid. Elon Musk is white. And you're kind of thinking like, is he like the person who just like grew up in the divided society and kind of bringing his own prejudice to the US? Or like it was just a complicated country, he doesn't want to have something to do? What do you think, and why you think like why he's not proud of South Africa, because there is something to be proud of South Africa as well. So he doesn't feel he belongs to the movement who destroyed apartheid.
Elon Musk grew up in apartheid South Africa as a white person, and it was apartheid South Africa that was run by an oppressive white government. He was brought up by a racist father. He grew up in a racist household, and his father is very openly racist. He now tries to clean up his image, but actually there are things that he has said in the past, very derogatory about black people, about this country. So Elon Musk would have been influenced by that. And then obviously he goes to the United States and is part of a white diaspora that was not happy with the changes in South Africa. So instead of being proud of the country of Nelson Mandela, he actually, I think, resented the fact that white people had lost power. But the strange thing about Elon Musk is that at some point in his life, he was a Democrat. Then clearly something switched in his head and he went back to what he grew up with, and I suppose, and then became this conspiracy theorist. And that is what has now drawn him into the Donald Trump orbit. And he now spews the same rhetoric as those right-wing Americans, which is a very dangerous thing, because he's not just another conspiracy theorist. He's not just Steve Bannon or any of those right-wing nutters. He is the world's richest man. He's one of the most influential people in the world. He owns probably the most powerful media platform on the planet. And now that person is not only powerful in the sense of being close to the president of the most powerful country in the world, but actually is working within that office, and he's influencing the agenda of the next 4 years. It's a very dangerous thing for the world to be in that space.
That's why we started with him. But I still want you first to, tell a bit your story. So how did you become a journalist, so people who listen to you? I know you because, you're an editor of the South African publications. There was a chance you came to Ukraine, and thank you for this. But there is a longer story of your journey. Like you started as a journalist when you kind of from the young people of the movement. You were probably very young when, of the end of the anti-apartheid struggle, but still tell, how did it start?
I always wanted to be a journalist. I knew from the time I was in high school that this is what I want to do. And the reason I wanted to do a journalist was because I was very interested in politics, and I loved the English language. I loved writing. And so in thinking about what career do I follow, I was like, I am going to marry these two things, my love of writing and my love of politics. And also I was involved in the struggle as a young person, as a youth, as a teenager. And the media in South Africa, they were the media that was very defensive of apartheid. And there's a media that was very opposed to apartheid. And I read a lot of the media that was opposed to apartheid. And some journalists from those newspapers went to prison for their opposition to apartheid. The people who inspired me. In fact, the editor of City Press at that time, a man by the name of Percy Koboza, was my childhood hero. And now I'm sitting in his chair. And he spent a lot of time in prison. He spent a lot of time being banned from public activities. And at some point, I was like, if my career goes right, I will one day want to be in his chair. And he's no more now, but I still maintain contact with his children, and I tell them this. They know my relationship with their father, who I never met because he passed away before I even became a journalist. I was still living in Durban, in a totally different, far away from Johannesburg, so I never got to meet him. So I then became a journalist. I came to Johannesburg to become a journalist in 1990, just as Nelson Mandela was being released, just as the ANC and other liberation movements were being unbanned, and political prisoners were coming out of prison and exiles were coming back. And it was an exciting time, particularly for a young 19, 20-year-old person getting the chance to actually chronicle history from that point. And having been on the opposite side, been in the struggle now, I was sitting with the people that we used to sing about I now get to interview them. I get to criticize them. I get to see kind of like that. Actually, my heroes are not that pure. These revolutionaries are not what we thought they were. And as a journalist, you are taught to think critically. So as I say, the period from 1990 to 1994 was a very special period because, first of all, we didn't know whether this thing would succeed because there was a lot of bloodletting at that time. There was a lot of violence. The right wing was resisting the change that was coming, blowing up things. And between 90 and 1994, things could easily have gone the other way. While the negotiations were taking place about a new constitution, a new structure for South Africa, and what a new South Africa could look like, there were other people who were fighting to derail the change. There was the right wing, the Afrikaner right wing, who basically wanted to maintain apartheid and thought that democratic rule would be the end of white people. Then you had also a party called the Inkatha Freedom Party, which is basically a Zulu nationalist party that was fighting for, they wanted the restoration of the Zulu kingdom, the pre-colonial Zulu kingdom. Between the two forces, they found some common ground about that. We do not want the future that the National Party of the time and the ANC were bringing. So elections came closer and closer to 1994. The prospect of civil war was very real. We could have had untold bloodshed in South Africa. Blood was being shed then, but easily on the scale of a Yugoslavia but people say it was miraculous that we came through. 27th of April 1994, we voted and a new country was born. Nelson Mandela became the president, and the races that had been at each other, that had been filled with hatred and resentment of each other, became one nation. And people called it a miracle, but actually it was worked for. Those negotiations that from 1990 to 1994, they took a lot of give and take, and the force of a human being called Nelson Mandela, who was able to take the nation through that period, just carrying it on its shoulders. And then came the next 5 years, which was also very challenging because now we are a nation, but was still a divided country, and nation needed to be forged. And that was actually kind of like the hardest work. And if you were to credit Nelson Mandela for anything, kind of like the most would be the fact that he actually used his 5 years in office, 1994 to 1999, to actually forge a sense of South Africanhood. And he did many things that some of us who thought were more radical than him didn't like, but actually he did unpopular things. He fought for Afrikaans, which many black people thought was an oppressive language. He fought for the retention of the Springbok emblem as the emblem of the rugby team, which was very obviously at that time it was considered a white sport. He fought for the apartheid national anthem to be included in the anthem, in the new anthem. He did so many symbolic things, but which were very important. And he reached out across the races, across any enemies. So I think the South Africa that you see today, and like it didn't just come about, it was actually worked for. But it's not, again, then there did come a time when a lot of those gains were reversed.
It's totally ungrateful to go through the history of the 20 years, especially if you're a journalist, so many things happened. But how would you describe the current politics and maybe last couple of years, where we are politically now in South Africa? How you describe, the political status quo?
I would say the first 15 years of the South African Republic were really good years. They were difficult because we were coming from an apartheid past. And also you had ANC government, which was made up of people who were politicians, and some of them basically, once they got into power, the temptations of corruption then start to creep in. But the thrust and the direction of the country was right. And then came 2009 when Jacob Zuma took over as the president of the country. Jacob Zuma, I think, is the worst human being to have been born to this country other than the old apartheid oppressors, because he reversed so many gains of the first 15 years. In the 9 years or so that he was president, corruption basically became a norm in government. And it became the norm in the ANC. Everything was just driven by greed. Jacob Zuma was the ANC. He took over as the president of the ANC from Thabo Mbeki in 2007. And his reason, this will sound very familiar, that time he was the deputy president of the ANC. He was facing corruption charges, and his very close friend and financier with whom they'd done corruption was already in jail at that particular time. And Jacob Zuma was facing jail time. And he used his popularity, because he's a very charming and popular person, and he's able to relate to people as a man of the people and so on. And he used all of that to climb to power and become the president of the ANC, which then set him on course to become the president of the country. I mean, like, the essence of it is exactly the same playbook as Donald Trump right now. And so he went on to corrupt every institution, the prosecution services, the police, the tax revenue collector, the state-owned companies. Just became a cesspool of corruption. So in South Africa, we refer to those years as either the 9 wasted years or the wasted decade.
But how do you overcome that? Because then, in the people's memory, it can create this feeling that, like, first of all, it can, let's say, undermine everything ANC did before. It can allow some people to say, like, oh, they're the same, like there was bad apartheid, but now there are like the heroes came to power, but they are actually corrupt. So, like this kind of mismanagement, but also misuse of the party can create a revanchism by some. It would be an excuse for those who, like maybe even supporting apartheid would say like, they're in power, but let's see what they're doing, that's, so they can undermine the whole struggle. So what happened after, to ANC? Was the party discredited? Like, did it lost, support? It remains in power. It's, actually still the major player. But how the party dealt with that? This kind of revolutionary, heroic party. And how you, being the journalist coming from the movement, also dealt with that, being a senior editor here during all these years and now.
So during apartheid, the National Party government, their main argument was that, kind of like convincing white people that if we allow democracy to come to South Africa, if we allow a black-led government to be in power, in their terms, South Africa will go the way of the rest of Africa. And they would point to the worst examples of what was happening in some kind of in places like Nigeria that had degenerated in the post-colonial time. So that was their big argument. A lot of white people believed it, and it was a mobilizing tool for people to go and fight in the army to continue oppressing black South Africans. But then democracy happened, and the sky didn't fall on us. And actually, South Africans, it became a very prosperous country. Kind of the growth rates were really great, and actually there was a wide-scale improvement. White people got richer because they were operating in a democratic environment. They had access to a much bigger market because the black middle class was growing, and the world was open to South Africa now. They could trade with other African countries. They could trade with the world. And we created multi-millionaires, many of them who were white people. So white people had the best time in those first 15 years. And then came Jacob Zuma. And Jacob Zuma basically gave ammunition to those who were then able to say, we told you so, we warned you so. And because he became the kleptomaniac that people like Mobutu Sese Seko and many other African leaders had become before. So kind of like it was this movie was just delayed. So now South Africa is going down that direction. It was a very demoralizing time because of that. But also it was a challenging time for us in the media because we had to expose this and we had to safeguard the democratic values of the Republic. We had to give voice to those people who were opposing the direction in which Jacob Zuma was taking the country, and also strengthen voices within the ANC that were against what their party was being turned to. We had to be supportive of civil society, give them voice, and expose the rot. And we came under threat from the ANC of Jacob Zuma because then they wanted to introduce new laws to curb free speech. They wanted to introduce regulations, create a body, what they call the media tribunal, which would regulate the independent media. And that was fought against. Good thing there that it was not just us as the media fighting that battle. It was also the rest of civil society was fighting the battle. The churches and other faith groups also came to the party. South Africa really came to the party, and and Zuma was eventually Zuma was defeated in 2017 and he went off into the sunset. Now I would say we are in a much better space than we were 5-6 years ago when Zuma was ousted. The only thing that lots of people are unhappy about is the fact that the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, has not moved fast enough to slay the dragons of the Zuma years. Not enough people have gone to jail for the corruption of that time, and the reforms to the institutions, the rebuilding of the institutions that Zuma destroyed has not been as fast enough. But things are going in the right direction. What makes it even better is that in the May elections in South Africa, the ANC was cut down from 57% to 40%. So it's a much smaller party. It cannot get its way. So it has had to bring in other smaller parties in order to continue to govern. And those parties are holding the ANC to a certain standard. So I think the South Africa of 2024 is a much, much better place. You can already see the fruits of the new setup. I mean, like, the country is just a lot more positive. If you talk to business people, the business confidence is very much up. There's still lots of problems, obviously, kind of like poverties, unacceptable levels, inequalities, a big blight, and things like just social ills are still very much there. But you can see that there is a determination now to fix things. It won't be easy, kind of like destroying is the easiest thing, rebuilding is an uphill.
Mondli, because obviously there are other questions about Ukraine, Russia, the war. I think there are two things to explain. First, I don't know in which order, so I really want to explain the story we missed, Ukrainians. The role of the West and the Soviet Union in the apartheid, why there is something which kind of very close. But there is no way for me not to ask for somebody who kind of grew up in Kiev, who knew that apartheid was wrong and the people were persecuted. But I spent a couple of days here in all this museum, Apartheid Museum, Constitution Hill. I saw the prisons, I saw like the rules, and it's not like the first time I know how kind of organized apartheid was. That even like how structured, so many hundreds of particular laws, very well thought, how horrible system was. So before asking you about the struggle and, also international forces, which the legacy of what those countries did to South Africa is still there. It's felt like by Brits, Soviet Union, the US. What was your childhood? So what you could do was what you couldn't do when you were small.
As you say, apartheid was so highly organized to the minutiae, kind of like, but also so stupid. You talk about examples, I'll talk about the most stupid ones. And that was essentially parks, recreational parks were separated. In the park, there were benches that kind of like only white people could sit on these benches, and the benches where only black people could sit, and they were actually written there, whites only. And beaches were segregated according to who could swim here, and there were beaches that we couldn't go to. Buses were segregated in that way. There were white buses and black buses. And I have actually an anecdote about the buses one. So my mother had a friend, Claire, who's no longer alive now, and she was involved in the struggle. So Claire was a white person, and she was involved in the struggle. So as children, my brother and I, Claire would take us to town and to go just buy us ice cream and do things that children like. And then, but she would take us on the white bus. The bus driver, first of all, would object, and she would insist, and we would get onto the bus. But then the white people on the bus would swear at Claire for bringing these black kids onto the bus. And she would fight with these white people, and it just did not make sense to us as to why these people did not want us on this bus. And then we would get to town, and there were certain restaurants that we could not get into, and they totally refused, and she couldn't take us to the white beach because there it was a bit more dangerous. People could possibly kind of like, it's not as controlled as a bus. So then she would have to take us to the black beach, and the black people were not going to chase a white woman away. So it was like there were such silly things like those where the separation of schools. Oh yeah. So, and then in shopping centers, you could not use the same toilets. And it was the most incredibly organized thing, kind of like just at the segregation level. And then obviously kind of like then there was the oppression level where the blacks could not do certain jobs and could not go to certain universities. Yeah, and then we could not live. We actually had to live far, 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 far away. I would not be living in the suburb that I'm living in now if it was during the time of apartheid. And then you fast forward to today, and you see this normal as can be. I mean, like it's still a segregated society because most black people continue to live far, far away where apartheid kept them in what we would regard, what was regarded then as basically kind of like what it used to be called the houses that were built for black people in the townships they were referred to as matchbox houses because they were just tiny in a country with a lot of space and where kind of like white people had lots of space to move around in. But now kind of like you are in a society that's normal and you try to explain this. My children kind of like, they cannot understand it. They're in their 20s now, so they grew up so-called normal society in the same schools as everybody else. They can do everything they like. They make friends with white people. They've had white girlfriends, which back then would have been a no-no.
There is a separate story of the oppressions, of the persecution, the prisons, like the violence used against about those who are who demanding the rights, which was extreme. But at this stage, I want to say, so when there was a, apartheid regime, and like now to understand the geopolitical perspectives of the South Africa today, at that time in the 90s, Thatcher and Reagan, the leaders of the US and the UK were supporting apartheid. What I understand, Israel was supporting apartheid, while some of the European countries kind of were already against, and the Soviet Union played a role to fight. It happened. So there is a huge, quite a cordial relations to the legacy of the Soviet Union in this country. Can you tell a bit more? Russia played a lot with that, as if it's like the only country which, is always a friend of South Africa, though a number of the ANC members were, placed in Ukraine. And actually, Ukraine as a part of the Soviet Union, actually was not where Margaret Thatcher and Reagan were, like in other way. But can you really explain more the role of the Soviet Union and the other states? So how it impacts today's way the South Africans establishment, but also people see the world.
The Soviet Union and the other communist countries around the Soviet Union at that time were very much huge allies and supporters of the liberation movements, not only in South Africa, but also in other neighboring countries like Namibia and Mozambique, etc., etc. The Soviet Union was the biggest supporter of the ANC. Lots of ANC people were schooled in the Soviet Union. They went to university in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union supplied the ANC's army with weapons. A lot of ANC people in what was called Mkondo Wesizwe, the Spear of the Nation, that was the ANC's military wing. They trained in the Soviet Union and including Ukraine. And we who were inside the country were very much, we sang songs about the Soviet Union. We hero worshipped figures in the Soviet Union. Many kind of young people who were kind of slightly older than ourselves, who were itching to go and join Mkondo Wesizwe, to join the military, they would fantasize about going to the Soviet Union. So there's a lot of nostalgia in this country. There's a lot of nostalgia for the Soviet Union. But what some people in the ANC refuse to accept is that the Soviet Union was not Russia. The Soviet Union was all the states that made up the Soviet Union, including a country like Ukraine and so on. What Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin's propaganda machine has managed to do is to instill in many people in the ANC and even in broader society the notion that Russia was key to the liberation of South Africa. And that Russians are our historical allies, Russia is our historical ally, and so on. Which is ironic because, ironic and wrong, because what Russia is currently, it's a very opposite of the values of democratic South Africa. What Putin's party is, it's the total opposite of what the ANC stands for. It's of human rights, and it's a right-wing organization in every way. The Russia that Putin is creating is the opposite of the South Africa that the ANC is has been talking about creating. So it's a bizarre thing, and a lot of the support that has come from ANC figures since the start of the war, since the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, has been premised on that.
But beyond that, I think that there is a very strong American sentiment. Can you also a bit explain it? Because, how to say it, we kind of know, and the audience of this podcast definitely knows what can be wrong with the US. But also in this balance that still you do have relations with the US, you do have relations with Britain and the modern Western kind of countries. There is a colonial legacy. There is a legacy of so many wrong things, which the Europeans actually are responsible in this continent, in this country, including in the US. But then you just this idea that at the same time, you have all the discussion by the people saying but the US is CIA, it's so horrible, and the Russia is so good. But at the same time, this country maintains good relations with all these Western countries. There is a trade, there are the tourists, there is better relations, honestly, economically and on the level of the human beings with all those countries. So how would you describe also your current relations with, say, with the West?
So the 1980s were the years where the struggle against apartheid was at its peak. Those years were the years when Margaret Thatcher was in power in the United Kingdom and Ronald Reagan was in power in the United States. And they were very hostile to the ANC and and other liberation movements in this country. And they were very friendly with the apartheid government. And the fact that the Soviet Union was a strong supporter on the side, it kind of like it defined the anti-Western sentiment. And also kind of like, and there's also the element that kind of like we had the Communist Party of South Africa being very influential within the ANC as well. So that has remained to today. But the wrongness of that interpretation as well is that in the Western countries such as the United States and the United Kingdom and others, the anti-apartheid movement among the people was huge. The ordinary people kind of like would be on the streets. They were pushing for sanctions against South Africa. They were pushing for disinvestment of their countries from South Africa, for the isolation of South Africa, for South African teams not to come and play in their respective countries. And so the people were very much on our side. The fact that the governments were not on our side is actually, it doesn't add up that we would see those countries as our enemies, so to speak. But then also, here's another thing, is that, as you point out, the relations are very, very good. At the practical level, the trading those are our biggest trading partners, and the cultures also kind of like...
I think that's something for Ukrainians, Ukrainians who don't really understand that kind of like big global politics and like things maybe beyond Europe. That's what's something puzzling, that you would understand there would be pro-Soviet Union sentiment. And you would understand there is the historic kind of like negative attitude towards the US for what they did. At the same time, actually, like the country like South Africa as a democracy is way more integrated into the Western world than modern Ukraine, who is sometimes a hostage of this kind of Cold War era and is sometimes accused to be a bigger ally of the West rather than societies here who traveling often to the West, who has a better relations, who has a better trade relations. Because for us, we kind of like went into the Western world way later. We were still perceived as the post-Soviet country, as a Russian sphere of influence by the West, for way longer time than countries like a lot of countries in South Africa. So beyond everything, I think that makes Ukrainian puzzle that, to be honest, like if you look at the economy, at the media, we don't have Elon Musk going to the US. We don't have like this type of the level of the connections. Like we won't have that many Western tourists in here. We won't have this strong connection. And that's why it's very strange for Ukrainians sometimes to be like, you're the pawn of the West. And you're like, we have so less like real connections that we don't want what you're saying. But now I want to go to something, because we can talk for hours and hours about this past. And even just like, I would also insist that it's true that Ukraine tries to tell the story today that, ANC members were trained in Odessa, in Simferopol, and it was Ukraine. They're trying to tell this story. But there is something else, which I felt like just yesterday, I would understand. In ANC, there would be people who kind of are very sympathetic to Russia. There are actually the people who pay by Russia. There are people who could have been connected to even the Russian, security services. But at the same time, there are people who are having a bit different narrative. This is a narrative of the peace and reconciliations. And it was very interesting that yesterday, a day before, I've been at the panel listening to the conversation with the former member of the African National Congress, Matthew Posa. And what was interesting? He delivered like a remarkable speech, very, very touching. But in the end, when he started to speak about Ukraine, he just like said something again, like, and we need to end this war. The West need to stop to fund it. He looked like the good guy who is not on this kind of Russian sympathizers, but also because of this kind of idea of the tradition of, like reconciliation, negotiations, he says something we just let us stop and the West fund the war, and then it will be over. And we know that it's not exactly the case. In our case, we are surviving because we receive this support, and Ukrainians are fighting against this kind of war by the Russian regime. I would really ask like kind of more complex questions for you. We'll return. You were in Ukraine last year. You clearly like explain, what is good, what is right, what like the evil policies that Russia has. What is the way for Ukraine to tell its story that it's understood, also knowing that there is this one legacy, but that there is another layer, you have this tradition and being proud of, let's negotiate. We're in a situation like, this guy wants to kill us. It's really not just really like you sit in one table and in the end, they're a separate country, it's like, look, we are bounded to live with them all together. They can be our neighbors, but we can have a border and we have their troops somewhere away. How are you trying to tell the Ukrainian story also in this way that it's not always you can just like sit and negotiate? We tried, we were betrayed.
When the war broke out, in the first week of the invasion, I think it was in the first week of the invasion, very early, I wrote a big piece for my newspaper about what was happening because I understood it as aggression. There's aggression. Among some of my friends, obviously people with close ties to the ANC, I got phone calls, I got WhatsApps saying, why are you describing Putin as a monster? And then they would then go into the whole story about NATO, then how the US wants Ukraine to be a satellite state and all of that. And then would get into arguments. And when you come with facts, people kind of like then just resort to conspiracy, kind of like the CIA, all the CIA stories. So we go to Ukraine, and thanks to you for inviting us to come and open our eyes there. Then there was a picture that was taken of us when we interviewed President Zelensky, and then it was tweeted and it went viral. And then in South Africa, the conspiracies then started to go. Why are they there? Who sponsored this? Kind of like, is this a CIA-sponsored trip? And like all sorts of narratives like that. Even I was getting messages asking kind of like, why are you there? And then it's like, why didn't you go to Russia? And let them also tell you their side of the story. As if we are talking about equal things here, kind of like, and then like you tell them there is a country that invaded another. These are not equal kind of like aggressors. And there's a country that's trying to get the aggressor out. And there's a country that is subjecting the people of the other country to punishment and suffering and squeezing them. I was able, after having been to Ukraine, I'd get into those arguments and I wrote some stuff. And then, but also in engagements, in public engagements, I would also state these things. But what the trip to Ukraine really enabled us to do, enabled myself, I can just speak to myself, that yes, that there's an invasion, that there's this brutal military attack, but the cruelty of it, and the worst for me was what they did to the children, kind of like the abduction of the children. So once you tell stories like those, once you started to tell people stories about what the Russians were doing on the ground, in communities, the granularity of the oppression, I think a lot of people start to get it. And you will not convince people en masse, but once you start to change few minds, you will also change others. And I can sense a shift. I'm not saying because of what I did. The longer the war has gone on and the more open the aggression of the Russians is, I can sense a bit of a swing in mood. And I think also what Ukraine has done much more proactively now is to tell the story, Ukraine's story. There are people like Matthew Sposa whose minds you are not going to change. There are people in the ANC, kind of like particularly at leadership level, whose minds you are never going to change. They're stuck in the narrative. But what matters now is what policy positions South Africa takes in relation to the conflict. I think at the United Nations, they will still probably kind of like vote the same way because we are members of BRICS and we will just align with the BRICS partner. Something which is strange because a more powerful country like India is able to do something different. But we haven't gotten around to making that leap. But I think, you know what, under the new government of national unity, I think you'll begin to see a shift in positions.
There is this kind of political level, which, I can ask. But I think on a human level, I think that's what I feel from the Ukrainians who kind of don't understand the complexity. This idea why they don't understand. And I think the Ukrainians have to understand more about what happened here, and they need to be taught and learn. Have to, despite everything. But I remember very well that we were in Odessa together, and we were talking to this man who survived the very brutal tortures by Russians in, I think it was Berislav, in the town in Kherson region. And this man started to cry. There were you and then your colleague, another colleague from South Africa, I guess. You comforted him. Because also he just was like, I wouldn't understand these Russian soldiers, how brainwashed you are. And you would tell him the story, how the white young were brainwashed and thought that they were doing the right thing by doing apartheid. So there is something you can tell, and there is something on this deeper level when I feel like people generally would understand, because the abduction of children means something. The torture means something. This kind of, attitude which was to the people, it's something that you really like. That's what I think the part of the something which is hard to verbalize, but the Ukrainians try to say, if you know the pain, we maybe didn't know, we maybe didn't understood before. Before a torture chamber was a torture chamber, before it happens to your people, it was just a cell in the museum you go and see with a curiosity. But now we are different as well. We understand that, when I come to the torture to the cell in here, like 5 minutes drive from your house, I recognize a place.
Yes. And you now recognize what dehumanization is, because that's what the oppressor does. I mean, first they need to dehumanize you, kind of like the world that because you are not people. So I can, when you launch those missiles into a village, into a community, they're not people. When you freeze people during the winter, it's okay. They're not people. I think a lot of those nuanced and granular, I'm using this word again, granular stories need to be told. Simply trying to lecture people about that Ukraine was also part of the struggle, part of the Soviet Union, also part of the struggle. I think that's too late. I think Ukraine wasted a whole year, the first year of the thing, trying to court Europe, trying to court the West, and woke up very late to realize that actually the Global South, you need the Global South to understand the story. But it was in that first year, one of the greatest propaganda machines in the world was hard at work.
And that's something what I want to say. So tell us more about what was happening with the propaganda here, because we missed it, because the Russian propaganda was extremely active in Europe after 2014, after the first invasion, everywhere. RT was in the UK, everywhere. They were very present. They were really trying to confuse, pretty much successfully, part of the European Union. Then when it became so clear, because it was so close, it looked like they all pulled out their resources out of Europe because they couldn't operate there that much. They're returning. They're returning now in a different way. But what we understood, all the resources then, when they couldn't operate there, was sent to Mexico, to Brazil, and to here. So what's happened here? What's happening here with RT? What's happening here with the kind of a Russian propaganda? Because I think it's incredibly bigger than I could see it today in some parts of the world.
So in some countries, it was much more open. Let's say in a country like Zimbabwe, which is a close ally of Russia and also a beneficiary of Russia's legislation. So there were some countries where Russian propaganda outlets operated a lot more freely. Here in South Africa, it was a lot more subtle. They were doing social media to no end. So there would be these bots amplifying the Russian messaging on the war, demonizing Ukraine and Zelensky as puppets of the West. Because RT was, we were cut off from RT at some point when the feed was stopped. Then they started to flood WhatsApp groups and social media with videos of basically kind of RT and people speaking in support of the war. They would flood our social media and other feeds with independent experts with American accents talking about, and this is a professor from like Georgia University, whatever, kind of like there'll be clips of them analyzing this and the narrative there is that even some Americans see the work of the CIA in Washington. And I know people close to me who went down the rabbit hole, because once you start to consume that, you just go all the way. So that's still very active.
But the Russian propaganda is present here. It's online.
Yeah, and very active. And because you have people like in the ANC who still preach the gospel of basically kind of like those are our historical allies, they also kind of like inadvertently end up spreading the propaganda. And again, I must say that, Ukraine was very, very slow in acting to counter that. But also in countering it, doing it formally. Once they started to send the ministers, starting to send politicians here. Game has to play it differently and more cleverly.
I'm thinking a lot about that. The point is that, and it's not like I'm here not on the defense, we really all, actually the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the former one, they all admit that like we missed the time quite a lot. But when you think now about that today, you just really think like, we're still a country at war with limited resources, and it's so hard to choose the priorities, and there is so kind of limited resources you have. So, and of course it may sound like, oh, so you're not a priority to us, but you just really sometimes think like there is the limit. So, of course, for Ukraine, it's quite a task. How you really, deal with the world with the resources you never had. It really requires like a lot of effort from Ukrainian side, a lot of openness, but to some extent also like the understanding of the people like you, because like you have your mind straight, you understand what is right, what is wrong, what is like crime, what is not, and then you write your column without anybody telling you, because you just know how it is, what is invasion. So I think that there is this balance of like the common things we want to prevail in this world and like the humanity which prevails, when there is something Ukrainians can do and have to more, but also something where you just really know that like there is nothing, like we all kind of haunted by so many things.
In as much as you want to convince the South African audience and South African decision makers, there's also the Republicans in Washington, D.C. that you have to be convincing as well.
I'll finish like, so what the results of the American elections means for this place? What do you expect?
Trump coming back to the presidency, coming back to the White House, has caused a lot of trepidation in South Africa. Everybody is worried. Firstly, because, the most immediate one is the economic one. We are beneficiaries of that AGOA process and the AGOA deal, in terms of which some products from African countries can enter the US market tariff-free. And so there is an expectation that because of our perceived closeness to Russia, our pivoting towards a stronger relationship with China, and because of our position on Israel, that the incoming Trump administration may want to cut South Africa out of AGOA. So that will be an immediate thing. There is also just the longer term one of the fact that we will come way down on the priority list of a Trump America First policy. Then there will just be the hostility to South Africa. So it is terrible news for South Africa. Cyril Ramaphosa, in his congratulatory message to Trump, kind of like spoke about how great our relations were in the first, and how our relationships are going to be great, especially since seeing that South Africa is chairing the G20 for the next year. The US will be taking over from us. So Ramaphosa is playing on that we're going to have to be working together closely, you and I. And I think it's so naive. We are going to be in for a rocky ride diplomatically and in our relations with the United States. But fortunately, our relationships with the EU are actually sound. With Labour in power in the UK, the relationship there is going to be a much better one as well.
Thank you. I distracted you from something you love the most. You were writing. I don't know.
That thing.
You were writing your article still, but I want to thank you not for coming to Ukraine. I appreciate that a lot, but for your understanding and your openness. Without being told, without being asked, you just understand it as a human. And it's something we appreciate a lot.
No, I must thank you for being also and being able to, for enabling us to enhance our knowledge greatly. And also to, the connection that we had, we spoke about it earlier, the human part of it. I'm still, those memories of meeting real human beings, going into the homes of people who had nothing, who had been bombed by the Russians in those frontline towns and villages. And those people, with whatever little they had, they wanted to share food with us and share the food that they had and insisting. And that for me was, I'll never forget that image, because it was there's a term in this country that we use a lot called Ubuntu, humanness. And those people showed just that Ubuntu. And it was beautiful in the midst of all the suffering and bombardment. So, yeah.